started. Thanks. All right, good evening, everyone. I'll now call to order this special work session of City Council for Tuesday, June 17th, 2025. This is a non-legislative meeting, so it is a special one. This meeting and its participants are being recorded. We will take public comments at the end of the presentation this evening on topics related to tonight's presentation, and comments are limited to 3 minutes per speaker. It must begin with the speaker's name and block of residence for our meeting record. I will begin with a roll call of members. Mr. Harris is not here tonight, so I will be calling the roll. Councilor Ahmed.
Here.
Councilor Arroyo.
Here.
Councilor Kleekst.
Here.
Councilor Craig.
Here.
Councilor Diaz.
Here.
Councilor Hirsch. And I am President Baike, and I am here. Councilor Hirsch is excused this evening. I'll now turn it over to City Solicitor Barry Handwerker to start our presentation.
Good evening. Pleasure to be here. And this is a follow-up to our meeting on June 1st when I gave a presentation regarding this process and talked a little bit about how we got here, what home rule is, why we're doing it. And I'd like to start just a little refresher, real short on those. So the charter itself mandates that certain items be covered in what's called an administrative code. Provisions for the exercise of a control function for the management of finances, enumeration of departments, offices, authorities, boards, commissions, and other administrative units of the city, their scope of responsibility and internal procedures for adoption, budgeting, accounting, and financial policies, purchasing and acquisition procedures, policies and procedures related to HR matters. You'll note when you look at the screen in your materials that 3 of those topics are specifically in tonight's material packet. One of the things to remember is that we already have most of the information that you're going to see tonight. Most of it is already either in existing city code. So remember, we have a code of ordinances, codified code of ordinances. A lot of it is already there. Some of it is in the 3rd class city code, and some of it's internal policy that we've already been following and now is going to be codified as required by the Home Rule Charter. There are some new items that are being included, and I'll discuss tonight why we're including those new items as well. And then one last thing to remember. With Home Rule, we can do anything not prohibited by law, and the concept of that's why that's important, is that doesn't mean that you have a code that covers everything. And I remember I talked a little bit about reading through the charter, and as we move into the code in the first page of it, and we're presenting, these articles are not in order, we're presenting the ones that we think are, we divided these equally in half, and so obviously 2 of these 5 topics are going to be covered in the next section when we start with that in August. But the ones tonight deal primarily with the financial ends, and you're about to start going through some of the things that are newly required by the charter, which is the capital budget, which is coming before you very shortly, followed by a much earlier round of the budget. So it sort of ties in. So you're going to get sort of a refresher course on A, the budget process that the charter lays out, and B, some of the financial issues that get associated with the budget. But one of the things to keep in mind is, in terms of why that rule is so important, is the enumeration of powers, which we're going to get to shortly, follows what we've had for many, many years here in the city and follows what the charter says, which is council is the legislative body, the mayor's office and the administration executes and administers the ordinances that are adopted by council. So the fact that there's not an ordinance on something doesn't mean you don't have the ability to do it. If it's legislative, it means you already have the ability to do it by ordinance. And through both the charter and the code, you've already got a procedure for how you pass an ordinance. That doesn't mean you can't adopt additional ordinances, setting forth new procedures for different things, and that's part of the beauty, right? So when you look at municipalities that have home rule, other than, I'll use Pittsburgh as an example, which has a close to like 200-page administrative code, they also deal with a budget that's a little bit different than ours, a population that's different than ours, and they've over time legislated just about everything procedurally because they've adopted different procedures. So you still will have the flexibility to do that at all times going forward. And you have the ability to change whatever you adopt here as the administrative code at any time by ordinance. So it's the greatest form of self-governance and the most power that can be given to a legislative body in Pennsylvania. So that's the true beauty of what the Home Rule Charter has done for the city. So as we go into the first page, we're going to start with what I'll do here is sort of summarize the provisions, why they're there, and where they've come from. I understand you haven't read this yet, and that's quite frankly intentional, so that I can explain to you where it came from, so that when you read it in detail over the next couple of weeks and study it, you understand why we put it in. That doesn't mean that we're bound by it. This is simply a starting place. Based on my 35 years of working as a municipal solicitor, almost that entire time having some contact or work for the city, working with other municipalities. These are just a starting point where I think it's best practices, good recommendations. That doesn't mean that you have to follow. This is simply a place to give you to start working on this document. So the first thing is, if you've looked at a lot of state legislation and even some of our own city legislation, is we usually give the ordinance, and this will be ultimately an ordinance, a title. In this case, I chose Administrative Code of the City of Lancaster. I think, as I mentioned in June 1st, there's probably only really three choices: Administrative Code of the City of Lancaster, and City of Lancaster Administrative Code. As we often do with legislation, we put in a series of definitions. There's a couple of these I just want to point out because they relate to some of the provisions you're going to hear tonight that may be new and different than what has been existing under either city code, the third-class city code, or your existing practice. First of which is you're going to see a definition of conflict of interest. The reason that's in here, and you're not going to necessarily get to it as much tonight. There is a provision we'll get to a little bit tonight, but right now the state ethics code applies to a limited number of municipal officials and isn't as broad perhaps as some other things. And most of what you're going to see in the definition of conflict of interest is common sense, right? Like if things that are not supposed to be produced because of law, i.e. criminal information, child information, things of that nature, every city official should be bound to not disclose them, including council members. So that's one of the reasons that's included here. You'll see a definition of environmentally preferable product. So one of the things we're going to talk a little bit about later tonight is some new procurement concepts, and this relates to one of those. Lowest responsible bidder is one we've used this term many times, but the last phrase of this definition, typically lowest responsible bidder is the bidder who meets all the qualifications, who has submitted the lowest bid, and we award contracts based on that. To legislatively require and provide that if you are a proposed bidder and you have a history of fraudulent or irresponsible behavior in previous dealings with the city, you cannot be a lowest responsible bidder. So this is sort of helping to weed out those who may not have proceeded, and I don't have any to use as examples right now, but in the future, those who may not be honest with us in their submissions or we have bad dealings with would not be able to bid again. So it's meant as a deterrent to contractors to make sure they toe the line correctly. And then again, sustainable procurement, which is similar to the environmental definition we referenced before, and we'll talk about that again a little later. So as we move into now Article 2, powers and divisions of powers, Sections 1, 2, and the first part of 3 are really a reiteration of what's already in the charter and what we've already been doing for decades and decades, principally since we adopted an optional form of third city governance many, many years ago, which is the legislative power is that of council and the executive power is that of the mayor. What you'll see in the second paragraph of Section 3 is nothing really new. What's brought there is moving what's already in your city code regarding the emergency powers of the mayor and powers to declare a state of emergency, Those are both in your charter, and they're also in Chapter 136 of the City Code. So we're basically trying to make sure we don't repeat things, and when you repeat things, obviously you have chance for inconsistency, so they're being incorporated in here. The fourth paragraph, the third full paragraph, excuse me, in the section of powers of the mayor, there's some things now that the mayor does that are authorized by the third-class city code. They're not specifically referenced in the charter, but they've been added here, again, assuming that perhaps the city wants to continue the practice of having the mayor have the authority and power to take acknowledgments and instruments in writing to the business of the city, and the authority to solemnize marriages, and the authority to administer oaths and affirmations as the city business. So it's just, again, making sure that it's clear that the mayor can do that, assuming that this council wants the mayor to be able to do so. So Article 4, which deals with salaries of elected officials, the charter does contain a provision that requires that the salaries of elected officials be set by ordinance. What the charter does not do is say when, which leaves open when do we do this. And currently the third-class city code ties that into certain times for submitting petitions and paperwork to be candidates, and the concept behind the provisions in the third-class city code is to make sure that everybody who might want to consider running for the mayor has the ability to know what the salary is before they, A, file their, or any elected position, file their papers, and B, that we don't get sort of the funny games that could happen, right? Which is now, because the salary was, say, low, and now 2 weeks after their deadlines to file, council who has 4 members running for council decides to change the salaries. So what I've put in front of you in Article 4 is what the third-class city code currently provides, which governs that date and protects from both of those occurrences. So Article 5, requirements of elected officials regarding confidential information. This is what I mentioned when I talked about the definition of confidential information. Really, this is codifying common sense, responsibility, and decency. I also anticipate that there are provisions throughout the charter where provisions of the ethics code could end up being incorporated or brought, and this is one of those places. So now we move to some of the bigger sections, and Article 11 is budgets. The first parts of this, Section 1 and Section 2, are really repeats of the charter, and the reason we're repeating them here is because remember what I told you the charter told us we have to do in the administrative code? Even though the charter covers the process for budgets, the charter also says we have to have a provision in the administrative code, so it's bringing that forward here. Section 3 is also information that's currently in the charter, but we're showing it in what we think is a little bit easier way for council and members of the public to understand, which is the time frames for adopting both the budget and the capital budget, sort of in a tabular form. All this information is in the charter, but you have to read through a lot of words to figure it out, and so we're trying to put the dates in a way that can be used as a roadmap by everybody for years to come. You'll notice that we have provisions for budget hearings, both for the budget and the capital budget. And again, these are required by the charter, so these are just carry forwards. Where we start to fill in what are things left by the Home Rule Study Commission to council, appropriations and transfers is one of them. The provisions you have in front of you are exactly what we've been practicing under, and what are in the third-class city code, which is how we make appropriations and then how we have transfers or what transfers are allowed, keeping in mind that only minimal transfers between departments are allowed without council approval. So continuing the check and balance that while the mayor and the administration enforce and execute the ordinances, the budget is still council's, and there's that work together requirement and council ultimate approval of changing a document that they already approved, namely the budget ordinance. So then we move to Article 12, which is finance and accounting. And again, a lot of these things seem and are common sense, but without legislation, you can end up in dispute. So first, we want to make sure that the Director of Administrative Services is required to deposit city funds. And Tina, if you don't, we have a problem. But we want to make sure, and otherwise the Ethics Commission, which is now forming and going to meet, is going to have code provisions that will deal with you. But the Director of the Department of Administrative Services shall deposit all city funds, taxes, and other revenues into such financial depositories as approved by the mayor in the name of the city. The next sentence is something new. And this one is, again, best management practices that we're suggesting, which is the city should seek to maintain as few bank accounts as possible, and that's an internal control mechanism. The more accounts, the more ability there is, obviously, for people with access to move money, and it's a pretty strong internal control function going back to my days in my accounting classes in the 1980s. The next section then on city funds. So what you have here is really a description of the types of funds. And these are funds that we've been using and have been authorized, but have never really been defined or described. And so this will hopefully help you, future council members, future and members of the public in understanding when the words funds are utilized and discussed at the during budget time and during the course of the year, what we're really talking about. And you know, one thing to keep in mind as you go through the funds is a fund is not the same thing as an account. A fund is an accounting term. So we can have one account, right? But it could actually hold money from several funds, right? The funds are how we're accounting for money. The account is the physical place where the money's kept. Now that doesn't mean we might not have a separate account for each fund. And in many cases we will, but legally it doesn't mean that they have to be one and the same. So you're going to see a lot of definitions and descriptions here. General fund, and I think that's the one everybody's the most familiar with. Obviously it serves as the general operating fund of the city. Special revenue funds are funds that are utilized with respect to specific revenue sources that are restricted for specific purposes. Debt service funds, I think most of you have had some introduction to that through the debt ordinances that have come your way over time, but again, that's how we're dealing with the repayment of debt. Capital project funds. These are funds specifically set aside for capital projects where they have restricted and committed access, you know, for particular capital projects. Proprietary or permanent funds. So again, these are used to account for and report resources that are restricted to an extent that only earnings and not principal can be used to supplement city programs. Again, these are the types of funds that can be utilized, not requirement that we have them. This is more about, hey, this is the way your accounting system may ultimately place funding. There are two types of proprietary funds that are typically dealt with. One, you're probably pretty well familiar with it this time, which is enterprise funds. And those are the funds where we're talking about a segment of the city operations that really functions as an independent sort of entity from an accounting standpoint, wants to account for its expenses, its revenues. Typically, these are tied to places where we have user fees, specific user fees that are funding operations. The biggest examples of this are your water fund and your wastewater fund. Those are enterprise funds. Internal service funds are funds that are used to account for loans or transactions between city departments. So another type of accounting fund that can be utilized that you might see in place or in your audit or in your budget process. And then obviously we have fiduciary funds, which are things like your pension funds. We also have some other types of funds that are authorized under law, and they've been inserted in here, private purpose trust funds and custodial funds. And again, the definitions are here, but the concept here was rather than funds are utilized, the word fund is utilized throughout many documents, and there's no place where it's been summarized for city staff and city council members and residents to understand. So this is a place to codify what we're all talking about when we talk about those funds. And quite frankly, many of those are we've already been utilizing them. It's past practice. The auditors have been referring to these in the audits you get every year. This isn't new, but it's new to be in sort of legislation of the city. Section 3 deals with investments. So the next series of sections, or if you recall, the charter requires us to talk about financial policies and management. And so the next sections, and Tina is here along with the mayor, these are essentially policy statements and projections of best management practices related to some significant financial dealings of the city, right? So the first is investments. And, you know, the goals and purposes are set out in this section. The objectives of what investment should be are set forth in this section. The standard that's used to judge, which is the same standard our auditor uses. So again, it's not new, but it's not all of it is new, but it's about taking a lot of the things that this city has done and codifying them, and now being able to hold everybody accountable to be in the same place, right? And it directs and authorizes the mayor and other bodies responsible for the management of funds by the city to adopt and maintain policies related to this. You're going to see at the end there's a significant reporting requirement. So funds can't be invested and then not reported. Like, that's an internal control, and that's the balance between, again, you control the budget as council, the mayor's executing on that ordinance, but there has to be reporting back. The types of investments, these are a series of investments that are fairly standard investments for municipalities to enter into. There's a series of guidelines that are put out for government entities. These come right from them. These are the types of investments that are deemed to be best practices investments for municipalities. And there's a list of about 9 of them here. And then there's a series of, we talk a little bit about the types of things that are ineligible, so that we're again starting to be clear about what is and what isn't allowed. You know, the reality here is municipal investment is conservative in general, right? That is, I mean, you would not invest, most people around this table would not invest their money identically with the way the city is required to. And why is that? Because you're stewards of somebody else's money. It's not your money to take risk with, it's your money to invest prudently for the benefit of 60,000 residents. So the standards here are not like, okay, well, we're gonna go invest in this necessarily right away in the stock market and go into sort of, you know, higher risk investments. That's not the concept here. The city's already been authorized to invest money and has done so for years in various funds in various ways. The key is now defining what is sort of the guidelines by which we do it. And that's what the investment provisions are supposed to set forth. You'll note that Section F talks about reporting. And here, what we're suggesting is that the Director of Administrative Services provide to the Mayor and City Council quarter-annual reports, providing a clear picture of the status of the city's investment portfolio, broken down to, you know, individual securities, average life and final maturity of the investments, coupon discount or earnings rate, par value, amortized book value and market value, percentage of the portfolio represented by each investment category, confirmation that the portfolio complies with applicable law, discussion regarding non-compliance, and description of city funds, investments, or programs that are under management of contracted parties, including lending institutions. I'd like to say I take credit for coming up with that, but I didn't. Director of Administrative Services, working with, again, governmental agencies responsible for financial reporting, has gleaned these as the best practices and suggested. So the next section moves on to borrowing. And the city's authorized under the Local Government Unit Debt Act, and remember that's one of the acts I sort of referenced in the definitions, to borrow. But again here, this is following the charter and saying you're supposed to have sort of some policy objectives built into the code that guide both council and the administration as you move forward with borrowing. And so, again, the objectives of debt and debt management policies. Here, the mayor, with council approval, based upon the advice and Director of Administrative Services, is to issue and maintain a debt management policy. So what you're saying here is, Mayor, you need to go and come back to us with a debt management policy that we must approve. So you get the final control on how we're going to manage our debt. Those policies, you know, in section B, list a whole lot of things that should be in there, including the limits, and how that, and the parameters and the guidelines. But legislatively, what you're doing is setting forth a requirement that policies be drafted by the people that are responsible for working with the city funds on a daily basis, and then bringing them to you for approval, and obviously explaining them to make sure that they meet with your approval before they're initiated. It sets forth a requirement that all issuances of long-term debt must comply with the applicable law, and must be approved by council by ordinance. So again, this would seem to be common sense, but we want to make sure it's clear. The city can't issue debt without you guys approving it, and approving it not only by a motion, but by an ordinance, which, when we get into August and September, we'll talk about ordinances, but the charter provides that ordinances, just like currently, have to be read twice and go through 2 meetings with the formality for advertising, so nothing's really going to change there. The public's going to have the opportunity to be notified and come in and say, we like this or don't like this, and for you guys to have to receive comment on that before it's adopted. And then there's a provision regarding how investment of bond proceeds should be handled. And again, this is fairly standard by most bond issuers and is best practices. There's nothing there that is really new than what we've been doing, but it's codified into administrative code for you. Section 5. We move into the accounting system, records and principles. Obviously, we need to have an accounting system. It sounds like common sense, but we want to make sure it's legislatively required. And we've put in what we believe are both current practices and best practices for what the accounting system must do and should do and how it should be set up, including that it should be an electronic system. It needs to be able to keep records. It needs to be able to produce reports. It needs to be able to maintain distinctions with respect to the character of expenditures. It must be able to differentiate between funds. It must be able to do all sorts of the things that we need to do on an accounting basis. Essentially, we need to be able to have an accounting system that complies with our auditor's reports and the internal controls that the auditor sets forth based on generally accepted accounting principles. We codify the current method of accounting that's been in place for quite a long time, and again is the recommended method of accounting for governmental entities, which is an accounting system on a modified accrual basis. It talks about fund accounting principles and policies, and we already talked about the funds. So this explains now that the policies on fund accounting and where that would tie in. Again, for fund balance requirements, we're suggesting that the mayor prepare, with advice and consent of the Director of Administrative Services, a fund balance policy to establish how balances, the policies related to what balances to keep in what funds, at what times, under what parameters, should be drafted and brought to you for your review. These are things that the mayor and administrator should implement, and any policy under that we're going to, in the next section of the code when we bring forth, any policies that are adopted, even when they're not, they're internal and they don't necessarily require council for review or consent, if they affect the public, are going to be, we're suggesting that to be required to be posted on the website and readily available for all, so everybody knows how we operate and why from a transparency and an accounting standpoint. Sectional 6, transactional processing. So again, this is really tying into the accounting system, but how do we get things approved and processed? This is really codifying our past practice and current practice and common sense. Like there's multiple levels of approval here built into getting transactions done. The charter already provides restrictions on controller requiring a sign-off before checks are issued. So this is not anything new. This is essentially codification so everybody can understand and see the actual practice. We have set forth provisions regarding some monthly and quarter-end duties of the Department of Administrative Services regarding reporting. Some of these are pull-outs from the charter, and some of them are expanded, but essentially there's monthly financial reporting and quarter-end financial duties, all on a reporting end, and then there's year-end reporting. And again, this is to assure that all of the proper procedures are looked at regularly by this council, available to the public. Nothing more I can really say about that. Section 7 is warrants and checks. Again, we need to gain a lot of common sense here. We need to legislate that, yes, checks will be issued, and here's who they're signed by, and how it's done. One thing I'll note here is something that you won't see in a lot of older administrative codes because it didn't exist, is the use of electronic signatures, which we're suggesting be specifically authorized here. And that is common in the banking world today. It is common in the business world, and it is also common in the municipal world. So it's not something like we're breaking new ground, but Section 8 obviously requires us to make payroll and to process it. Again, there's people that work for you that need to be paid. Section 9 is really a new provision. It codifies a lot of what's been you've talked about and what you've heard about in both audits, discussions with particularly Tina and Director Campbell regarding capital budgeting and capital projects. It talks about the accounting principles used to define what is a capital project or a capital asset, so that sometimes there's a lot of confusion about that, and this is a way to clarify utilizing generally accepted accounting principles. And for those who aren't aware what that is, in the professional accounting world, there is a nationwide standard of what's called generally accepted accounting principles. It's essentially what your auditors are looking at when they look at your records. Covers both internal controls and the functional ways you record in your books transactions. That's supposed to be a national best practices, and it's the standard that generally is applied across the country. Article 13, procurement and disposal of city property. So Section 1, dealing with the centralized coordinated purchasing system, really is a pull-out direct, and again, this is, past practice, current practice, but it's a pull-out both from the charter and your optional third-class city charter law. This is essentially what we've been operating under. It's a centralized and coordinated purchasing system. The procurement process and policies are separate from the system. The system is the functional way in which purchasing gets approved and or a purchase is actually made, like making sure that it's approved by the right people, goes through the right accounting steps, and ultimately gets issued. The procurement process, this essentially codifies what we're doing right now, and is very and is an adoption which you're not required to do. It is an adoption in most places of the third-class city code and the way the third-class city code suggests doing procurement. A couple things with procurement are, what the third-class city code does is say for different types of purchases at different amounts, we're going to require a different level of work on behalf of the city. So for small purchases, you don't have to go through this long bidding process. You don't even have to get estimates. You can use whom you want as long as there's no fraud and conflicts of interest. As you get into moderate level, small but moderate, you need to get 3 quotes, right? And as you get to larger contracts, you need to put them out for bid. And it also incorporates all of the exceptions to those that are built into the third-class city code, because there's a lot of contracts that don't make sense to go through that process. Sometimes they don't make sense to be required to go through that process is the best way to put it. You know, examples, the biggest examples are gonna be professional services contracts. That doesn't mean that from a policy standpoint, city staff isn't encouraged to go through RFPs and some sort of formal process to identify parties, but mandating it can sometimes put hamstrings and handcuffs on getting the things done. So the exceptions that are built in here are the exceptions that are already in practice in place. I will note there's one that's added, which is emergency purchases. Currently, the law without home rule requires that it allows for an exception for emergency purchase, but it puts the standard of emergency to such that it's virtually impossible, which means it's not an exception. So there's been added here an addition of an emergency that's not part of a declaration of emergency, which is two different things. In a declaration of emergency, we clearly want to be able to go and purchase without going through bidding. But there are times, and I can use examples, let's say a water main breaks and it requires a very specific type of pipe to fix, and we're gonna end up with millions of dollars of loss of water if we don't go to this one company we know local that has the pipe. Right now, we couldn't do that. We would have to put it out for bid theoretically, unless we used one of the other exceptions, and there might be one there. But we would theoretically, you'd have to put it out for bid, and that could take months. And in the meantime, we're losing water. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's the only addition on to what we're doing currently. And all of these things, again, everything in here is a starting point for discussion. The fact that we're doing it now doesn't mean it can't be changed. Doesn't mean it's just the starting point when we put it in. And you'll see what Angela's put up on the screen is sort of the current schedule. And what the third class city code does is it adjusts this annually with a Department of Labor and Industry increase that they put in place. And we've included that annual increase in here so that these numbers will increase, and then we would have to update the schedule every year, and it would just become part of the code. So that again, from your standpoint, resident standpoint, taxpayer standpoint, and those who are just looking to say, I want to bid, but I don't know what the policies are in the city, it's going to be right here, legislated. You don't have to go and ask for it. You'll see in here in paragraph G, right to reject bids or proposals. This is built into every procurement, but we're legislatively putting it in so that now there's no argument in a bid dispute that we have that right. Again, this is to protect the city, which is, you know, if your bid doesn't comply, we have the right to reject it. And the next provision, charter and liability limit, as a matter of law, typically you can't enter into a contract that doesn't have funds allocated for it, right? So like if contracts expend over year to year, this is a provision that basically says all of our contracts should include a provision, just like the state does in the federal government, you have to have funds allocated. The last section I mentioned at the very outset when we went through definitions, and this is sustainable procurement. In 2019, the city adopted the city's municipal climate action plan. This is a step towards trying to implement it. There's no mandates here about doing sustainable procurement. There is a mandate that the procurement office and city staff should start considering in each of their procurements whether there are means to get procurement that's better environmentally. That was the first definition, and that is sustainable over time. So these are things to start moving the climate action plan forward. Again, not at the point of a mandate that everything has to be sustainable or environmentally protective. My recommendation at this point is that would be too restrictive and would require new staffing to be able to even get it accomplished. But to start looking at it and building on it is something I think it's the time to do. It's consistent with this council's directives over the last 6 years. So that's why that's in here. And again, these are suggestions as starting points. Sale and disposal of city property. Sale of personal property. Right now, any property would have to, under the third-class city code, if it's $2,000, we have to get city council's approval to sell anything. We have to estimate its value, and we have to come forward with your consent. The proposal here is to tweak that a little bit, because we used to hold annual surplus sale. There's lots of stuff that becomes absolutely useless to the city anymore, and that definition is included in here, and where we have that, what we want to do is authorize the Director of Administrative Services to arrange for a public sale and or other necessary sale of surplus materials. And that if it doesn't fall into that, then, need council approval, but it would all require advertising, and, Director of Administrative Services needs to formulate procedures for this, policies and procedures, again, so everybody would know. Sale of real property, essentially, this is just the provision that you already have an ordinance in place on this, and it's essentially incorporated the ordinance in here. The exceptions built both into that ordinance and are built into here are the exceptions that are currently provided for in the third-class city code. So again, that ordinance was created and adopted in accordance with third-class city code, and it's just been brought in to this document. A new item is the donations of both personal and real property. Currently, it's very limited as to what you can donate property and how you can donate property, which has proven to be a bit cumbersome for entities that could really use it, and trying to scrape out $1,000 when it would benefit the citizens much more greater to have a service entity in the city be able to utilize the property. So we've given you here some starting points for discussion of those. With personal property, if it's valued at $5,000 or less, Director of Administrative Services, in accordance with policies and procedures to be adopted, would be able to do that. Over $5,000 would need, council consent. So, having to come in and ask, should we be, do we give you your consent to donate maybe it's a computer worth $50, maybe it's a computer worth $100. It just seemed to be not to be an efficient way for you to operate. So this is a procedure to try to get efficiency and still protect the taxpayers to assure that, the assets of the city aren't being gutted, right? And then donation of real property, this requires approval of council. And so this is, if a small piece of real estate is better in the hands of an entity, you have to approve it, which means that you have to assure that you don't want to get the money in lieu of the donation. You have to make the cost-benefit analysis. It's not saying that the city's going to go and donate property. Again, this is just legislating a process for doing that doesn't currently exist. So the last two sections are relatively straightforward. Again, insurance and bonding, these are things that we currently do. Bonding is covered by the third-class city code. Insurance is something we absolutely want to have, need to have, and we want to make sure that it's legislatively directed that we do have. Article 15 is really new. There is a Pennsylvania Records Retention Act. What we're doing here is making sure that we have an ordinance in place that says we will comply, which is one of the requirements of that act, and directing that we comply with it. What this really does is create schedules for how you can destroy paper records, provided that you have electronic copies, right? And there's a whole manual on that, based on the type of record, the content of it, as to when a paper record can be destroyed. It doesn't require that you destroy them. It's just saying you can do it after this period of time, and this is a state act that governs municipalities statewide. And then record disclosure. This is something we know we already have to do. We have to comply with the right to know law, and so we've again legislatively said, not only do we know we have to do it, but we're going to direct that we do it. The city administration must comply with the right to know law. So those are the provisions that I wanted to present to you tonight, and I know you haven't had the opportunity to read them, so I've spent 45 minutes. What I would like to do is, just ask Tina and the mayor if they have any comments in terms of the why we've put things in here, and then to open it up for discussion as to why we have these, understanding that you're going to now spend, and so is the public, a significant amount of time reviewing these, going over the detail of the language so that we can have really good discussion next month at our next meeting over, hey, why can't we make a change to this? Shouldn't we add this? That's where I would expect to go in the next meeting. This is really for me to explain to you what's here and answer any questions as to why I might have included it, or as to the genesis of it, so that you have that comprehensive understanding. So with that, Mayor, Tina, do you have anything?
I really don't, except to say that for the public who is listening, who wants to read and ask questions or make comments about any of the administrative code topics that are included in this first tranche, you can go to Engage Lancaster, and there is a section specifically to the admin code to be able to read and comment and submit your questions. After each meeting, there'll be an open comment period for 2 weeks for the public, and we're also asking council to submit your questions, but you're going to be sent a JOT form to complete the questions, and that is so that we don't, we avoid any potential for violation of Sunshine Act with 2 or more of you potentially commenting. So we just want to make sure that we are on the straight and narrow with that. As it relates to the content that's presented tonight, I just want to thank Barry and thank you for sitting through a 45-minute lecture tonight.
Sorry to make it a lecture.
Yeah, I don't know how to avoid it. But I think that the main thrust of tonight's conversation is just that there's a lot of different places that information is flowing into this document, whether that's from the charter itself, whether that's from the state charter code, whether that's from what we've currently been doing, or that it's new and based on a best practice that hasn't been adopted before, which goes to some of the reporting elements in the finance and budgeting, as well as specification related to investments that are allowable and those that would be ineligible. So a lot going into this document, and as Barry said, nothing about this document is written in stone. This is the first tranche. We'll be bringing a second round to you in August.
August.
And then 2 discussion sessions, and then just to make sure everybody understands, there will be 1 vote on the entire administrative code that will be, is tentatively scheduled for November. And that just is, just to be clear that these are work sessions and we're not taking any deliberative action during this time. It will be introduced just like we do all the other things. It'll be a first reading, a second reading, and a vote. Tina?
Yeah, I don't know if people can hear me, but I don't have a lot to add. I will just say that specifically the sections around investment, debt, and cash reserves, they are, as Barry stated and the mayor emphasized as well, these are taken from either best practices, practices that we've already been doing, and really the main focus that we pulled it from is around organization called GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, and so they produce a lot of good guidelines, state specific as well as some national guidelines, so we've been looking at those. And I will just say, for those 3 sections in particular, these are not intended to be full policies. They're intended to kind of state what the policies should have in them. So we're still going to be bringing policies to you all around these, but this is really kind of stating what is needed in those policies.
So, you know, from my perspective, that really sort of concludes what I wanted to present to you tonight. What I'd like to do is just, you know, go around and ask if you have any questions regarding the presentation I made back in June about home rule in general and how it applies to this, and about sort of the broad philosophical topics that we've addressed this evening. You know, as to specific language questions, those I would prefer we get into at the next session when we can look at them in concert with others, because what ends up happening is when you change one section, it sort of snowballs across the board. So, you know, with that, Council President, I'll turn it back to you, but that's where I would like to see, you know, I would suggest we take some discussion tonight, if there is any.
Sure. Thank you, Barry. I guess you can tell me if this is broad enough or if this is too specific.
Sure.
And I'm looking at one particular section, but I'll make it broad. So in some of these sort of, well, particularly under the finance and accounting sections, some of these get very specific. And so who ultimately is sort of responsible for enforcement of these guidelines if it's not something that, like, this is this quarterly report that needs to go to council, or this is a function that needs to happen? So, like, can you speak to how some of these processes work in concert with maybe like employment practices or HR practices? I'm not really sure, but
Well, the financial ones aren't going to really tie into HR personnel.
Sure.
This is really the management of money.
uh-huh.
It's the administration's obligation to manage the money in the way that these policies and/or provisions are set forth. The reporting is intended to give you the ability to make sure they're complying. B, it gives the auditor, will be looking back at our policies to say, are you actually complying with your own requirements, which have been legislatively enacted? Obviously, negative audit reports have very negative implications on the city going forward. So there's an incentive, obviously, for the administration to do so. There will be provisions. I mean, there are provisions at law that don't get incorporated herein. Obviously, council can end up with a dispute with another elected official. So, I mean, there have been municipalities where the mayor and council have been vehemently at odds, and it's resulted in litigation. And council has the right to seek litigation to direct the administration to comply with the rules and regulations if they're not. So ultimately, you have the power to compel. The procedure and how you do it is going to be a little bit left to council based on the facts, if that makes sense. Like, you know, I don't always recommend litigation. I would hope that, you know, if you see something that's not being done, the adults in the room can have a conversation and get to a place of concurrence on how to move forward, acknowledging that in not all of the municipalities across the Commonwealth has that always happened.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you very much. We'll just go around as we're sitting, if that's okay.
That's good.
Any thoughts, Councilor Craig?
The only question that I have is, along with the charter and the information that we're given here, am I going to be able to find like most of the answers that I need? And if I can't find the answers that I need, who do I call?
So
or do
again,
I need a book like yours?
Well, you don't need a book. The person that's going to get you the answers is sitting in front of you and speaking to you.
Perfect.
I'm not hiding anything from you. I will not hide anything from you. That's not my role here. My role is to get you a document that works for you. I will tell you very clearly where language came from, why it was put here. You don't have to go searching for it. The reality is that you really don't need to read any of the other things. You need to read this. If you want ideas, there's a third-class city code. There's a first-class city code. There's a second-class city code. There's a first-class township code, a second-class township code. You know, there are multiple municipal codes where these types of things have been dealt with. So the beauty here is, because you're home rule, you're drafting your own code. So there's no right, there's no wrong, other than we have to comply with the charter and we have to comply with the constitutional requirements of Pennsylvania and any state requirements that the legislature has put in place. So, for example, there are some laws that we can't deviate from. Like, we are required to comply with things like the public utility laws. We can't change those. They govern every and all municipalities, right? Eminent domain rules are governed by an eminent domain code that applies to every municipality, regardless of home rule or not. So the reality here is you're starting from scratch And so the concept that we came up with in order to present you with a code was to give you a code that is balanced by, this is what you've been doing. We've been doing it for decades, either under the third-class city code, the optional third-class city charter law, that contains provisions that are required by the charter and that offers some new language or new ideas from our role within the city and watching the city grow over the years.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Craig. Councilor Kleekst.
Thank you, Madam President. So I haven't read it yet, so I don't have really many questions, but I was looking at section 1 where we have the definitions, and how did you come up with those concepts, or where did you get them? Because I know that we have other concepts, so for example, like the departments, bureau, office. Sometimes we said, for example, the Bureau of Lancaster, the Police Bureau of City Lancaster, or for example, we said the Department of Administrative Services or the Department of Neighborhood Engagement. We have offices, we have boards, commissions,
So
authorities.
those items aren't covered in the definitions. Those are covered by the charter and then by your own ordinances. So one of the things that you'll see in the next tranche
Yeah.
will be one of the requirements of the 5 that the charter requires is a breakout essentially of the departments, bureaus, administrative units, and their responsibilities. So those will each be discussed to some extent in the next section that you haven't seen yet. The definitions are terms that are referenced in various places in the code that one might not really have an understanding or might not be explained. So, we use the term confidential information. Okay, if I say confidential information, what's that mean? Well, the definition section was meant to cover that. Some of the state laws, so that we don't have to write out the citation for the entire state law, are built into the definitions. But they're ones that and where I got them is I defined the term, whether that was a term that's utilized by law, the specific definition, or a term that I wrote as being the definition.
So after reviewing it, so we all gonna read it, can we add the other definitions of other terms?
You can add or delete anything from this document. This is your document, not my document.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Councilor Kleekst. Councilor Arroyo, thoughts?
I don't have any questions or comments this
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you.
Councilor Diaz, thoughts, questions?
I just have one question regarding the transfers. You're saying that it's 5% of the funds in the budget line items. Does it matter how much it is? Like if it's in the millions, it's 5% of that particular amount?
Yeah, when you're referring to that there, and that's been the current practice, and that's only for transferring it from one department to another. It's not authorizing it to be spent in a, to change the fact that you've already authorized it to be spent. And this is, again, that provision is really relating to transfers between departments, and showing that we can't transfer more than, 4% essentially, or 5% without council approval. And even when they are transferred, there's a reporting requirement to notify council that they have.
Yeah, and it doesn't allow for an increase to the overall budget. It's just a transfer between the departments.
So that's the final amount. Like can the charter change it? Let's say you want to change it to like 10%.
Again, the provisions in this code, every one of them is changeable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Ahmed, thoughts and questions? There you go.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you, Barry, for your presentation this evening. And I really appreciate some of the good governance measures around procurement and around the budgets. I guess my only question and guidance that I would like to seek throughout this process is, how much of this should we leave kind of not specifically defined, and how much should we, for example, when it comes to things like accounts, should we make sure that each individual fund has its own individual account, and does payroll have its own individual account, or are these things that we should kind of leave by your recommendation as a little bit less specific and, like, the charter gives us the guidance, but how specific on some of these things should we go in the code?
Sure. My recommendations are what's in the code before you, and they're in part based on past practices. They're in part based on the third-class city code. They're in part based on my experience with other municipalities as their solicitor, and they're in part based on my experience seeing where other municipalities have struggled. The one thing that is here is you always will have the flexibility to get it more specific. So because this is an ordinance, you have the ability to always change. My recommendation, and this is simply a recommendation, is that what we're putting forward before you starts to make changes. It doesn't necessarily overturn the entire apple cart, and that as you see issues arise, that's the time to address by legislation because you do control it. If there's no reason, it's the old saying, don't fix what's not broken. At the same time, you want to put best management places in place to encourage change to get better. If something is a problem, address it. What's built into the code that we're presenting you tonight and then we'll continue to present to you in August are the recommendations that were meant to balance those, in all honesty. There are some things we're recommending changes to. We could have been as broad in here on financial policies as the mayor should adopt policies. That could have satisfied the charter. But my recommendation is to go far beyond that, right? That it does make sense to have some legislative understanding of what those policies should have in them, what the basic requirements should be, and then to let the professionals go to work to develop the policies based on the specific facts that the city is undertaking. And so that's how I've drafted this for you. And so I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis as to whether you feel there's something that needs to be more specific. And that's what I think these discussions should happen as we move forward into the next session. But yes.
And Councilor Ahmed, I would just add to that. I think you should just also consider about what kind of work you want to have come before council on a regular basis. So with setting up accounts, when we get a grant, so we just got a $35,000 grant from the Chesapeake Bay Trust, I believe, and that would have its own individual account. Do you want that level of detail coming before council on a monthly basis? Or are you satisfied with there being a reporting structure in place such that on a monthly basis, income and expenses are being shown and that financial report is given to council? And so I think you have to decide for yourselves how you want to be spending your time in terms of the regular business of council versus what is already being pulled together in a financial report. And also recognize that that is the purpose of our annual audit, and engaging with the audit process, I think, is one of the primary tasks of council in addition to overseeing and passing the budget. And so it is through the audit process that we have to prove that we are following GASB standards as it relates to our financial management. So I think you just have to decide kind of like how specific you want to go, and then think about where this thread might be getting picked up in other areas that are already coming to council.
And one thing I should note, and again, this is one of the reasons I suggested really taking a close look at the charter, is the charter actually provides a very expanded role of the city controller in being a guide with respect to financial policies, additional checks and balances on not only whether funds are authorized, but on the implementation and follow through of policies, on the selection of the auditor to perform the annual audit. So again, it's a continuation of building additional internal controls. And fortunately, the city's not been the subject of any municipal sort of fraud for as long as I've been around, and hopefully it goes on forever. But its best practice is to continue to make sure the internal controls are in place.
Thank you. And I just have one final question, and it's kind of in regards to with this new charter and some of the ambiguities of what state law is currently, what state laws may change. Is there anything in the administrative code that we could kind of put in to protect, I don't want to say protect the city and council, but so that for instance, every other day somebody isn't saying, oh, this state law, actually you can do this, or council should do this because of this state law, when it's kind of responsible governance to not just act on everything just because we have the,
Can I?
yeah.
Counselor Ahmed, I really appreciate that question, and if only there was that much activity in Harrisburg that actually affected our local government, we could have that conversation. But I can tell you, there's not that much that actually, on a regular basis, affects the operations of local government. Boy, do I wish sometimes. Sometimes I wish. Be careful what you wish for, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the other place, Councilman, that you have control over that is keep in mind that the act is most likely going to be legislative that you're taking. So that's certainly the question that council should be asking every time an ordinance has come before it is, have we confirmed, have we checked, do we believe that there's any state law prohibiting? The question is there any state law or constitutional requirement prohibiting us from taking the action that we're proposing by this ordinance?
And each one of them does state, it will take effect in accordance with all applicable state and local laws, which is, we get used to hearing that, but it is truly like a catching statement on all of our legislation.
It is. And, one of the things that you will see when we get to August is a suggestion, a recommendation for some additional documentation that should come to council and the public with every presented ordinance, whether that comes directly from council or the administration. And I gave a presentation that started to go into that a number of years ago about the types of things that should be looked at, thought of, and questions asked when an ordinance is adopted. And I've worked with that to pare it down a little bit. Instead of 12 questions, I think it'll end up being maybe 4 or 5. But the point being is it's sort of following a state process of having a memo in place. And it's that process that gives council members now and in the future assurances that at least it's been looked at. One thing I'll say is the law does change. It can change by a court decision. Yeah. And no matter how good your lawyer is, lawyers can be wrong. We can have an opinion that this is what the law says, and somebody can challenge it, and the court can be different. So the real thing is, and that's not to try and say and to skirt my duty, but the reality, it's a factual reality. So the main thing is to make sure that you're doing the due diligence to make educated decisions about what your ordinances do and whether, and again, I don't say whether you're authorized. The key is whether you're prohibited, because that's really the real change with home rule.
Thank you, and that concludes my questions.
Thank you. Great. I have one last thought of my own, and I just want to, thank you for putting this together. I particularly appreciate the tables that are included on the budget timeline and the other timelines, because reading through that in the way it is presented in the charter is complicated to follow.
It was complicated to put the tables together.
I can imagine. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. At this time, we can open up the meeting for public comment. I'll just remind folks, if they wish to make comment, they're commenting on anything that was presented before us this evening. If anyone wishes to do so, you can do so at the microphone at the far end of the table. It should be on and ready for you, and you need to begin with your name and your block of residence for our meeting record, and 3 minutes, which I'll time on my phone this evening. So if anyone wishes to do so, now is the time. Okay. All right. All right. Good evening. You'll have to take my word that I'm timing. So good evening.
My name's Alexander King. I live in the 600 block of North Shippen. And I have a couple questions. One of them is on the procurement numbers. And I was a bit surprised to see that the threshold for a public bid is just $23,000 and change. That seems like a pretty small sum for what strikes me as a fairly involved and onerous procedure. I was curious, is that state law requiring that? Or is there room to wiggle on that? And then if I can just, the other comment, just give them both to you.
Yep.
Is speaking of money, there has been a lot of talk in the last year and a half or so about council salaries, and I don't know if you want to address that as part of the administrative code, but I think it would be an excellent idea to make a plan on how council is going to increase salaries that haven't been increased in a very long time, so that there is some sort of plan in place, and it's not this always like, oh, should we do this? No, I don't want to anger the electorate. Should we do this? No, I don't want to anger the electorate. That, something should really be done there. That's.
Thank you very much, Mr. King. Mr. Handberger, if you want to answer those questions that were put forth.
Sure. As I indicated during the procurement discussion, the thresholds are the current third-class city law. Those are in place for third-class cities. While we're not mandated to comply with those going forward, it's my recommendation that we do. And while that number seems low, what it's doing is assuring that taxpayer dollars are getting the best service that it can for the dollars being spent. The procurement process and the thresholds do more than just the money. We've experienced here at the city that when we use public procurement, we find opportunities we didn't know existed, vendors we didn't know might be available, and ideas and concepts that we might not have thought of. So procurement is more than just simply how we spend the money, but the methodology forces us to be open and to make sure that we are doing due diligence for the taxpayers, residents, and those who use city services. As to council salaries, the mechanism for how to do that is built into the charter and the administrative code, as we discussed tonight. Whether council wants to adopt an ordinance or develop a plan for when to adopt an ordinance for changes in elected official salaries, that's certainly up to council.
Thank you, Mr. Handberger. Just to kind of put a finer point on the public bid threshold, these could be a myriad of services and contracts that we're talking about, from sort of like one-time transactions and to ongoing contracts as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any additional public comment this evening? Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, you might have to turn that back on.
Did Alex shut it off?
That sounded like it was on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Marshall Miller, 100th block of East Vine Street. It sounds like the final version of this will be voted on in November, and I was just curious how council has the ability to put like input, changes, things of that nature leading up to the final passage, or is it just final passage in November will be a process where amendments are added to do all of the changes that council would like to see? Separately, you said that this document pulls from a bunch of different sources, and I'm just curious if there is like a version of the document that outlines what is coming directly from the charter that cannot be changed or, touched because it has to fulfill requirements in the charter. And if that exists, that would be helpful for me to see, and probably council as well.
Thank you.
The answers to those are, there is no real document that does the detail you're asking for. Everything in this document can be touched. So again, there are multiple sources from where we drew inspiration for the language. In terms of the topics that are covered, there's mandatory topics. The language, other than the parts that come directly from the charter, it's all brand new, essentially, or it's a repeat of existing code, but it's sources that we're drawn from. There's no one document I can give you that will tell you where to go find every single line that's in this document. It's a new ordinance. It's a new draft, just like any other new ordinance that City Council would adopt. That being said, there are 4 working sessions. There's a procedure that the mayor discussed and will be available for council members and the public to submit questions. At the second session in a month, we'll work with consensus. So if this group by consensus says, hey, and that's more than less is what we mean by consensus, because ultimately there's still a vote at the tail end. We'd like to see, maybe this change to that, or this added, or this taken down. We'll make those changes and circulate them.
Mr. Hamburger, can I elaborate on that? Just
Absolutely.
to kind of just drill into the process. This is for everybody's benefit. So what we have is 4 work sessions in front of us. They're not legislative. And so that format will allow us to have the kind of discussion that's needed about this document that will not require motions and amendments and for every detail, right? Because that would be required if we were given this document in its form, motioning that forward and then opening up that discussion, that would be onerous. And so these work sessions are going to allow us to have that kind of conversation. And the format, first a presentation with general comments, impressions, a period of time where questions are to be received both by the public and by members of council, and then a second session where we come back and sort of put those out on the table and work toward consensus during discussion, will allow us to have a finished product that will come forward in the legislative process, where there's a first reading and a second reading. And not to say that there couldn't be amendments at that time, but hopefully in 4 working sessions where we have actual real discussion, we should be ready to adopt the document that we've worked on over the course of those 4 meetings.
That answers my question perfectly. Thank you.
Thanks. Any additional comments from the public? All right, hearing none, thank you everyone. I will close public comment for this evening. I believe that concludes what we needed to work on in this session. Mr. Henberger, Mayor Sirachi, is that correct?
From my perspective, absolutely. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Then I will hear a motion to adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. We are adjourned. I don't even have my gavel.